Good morning. This is Mike Shoeman. I am the chief steward of the Living Library, and I'm here with Taniya Hussain today. And we're going to be talking about the JCM conference, the JCM in Dialogue conference, which will be in Germany this year. So before we get into that conversation, I wanted to remind all the viewers that any time that you spend watching this conversation or any of the conversations, they are all creditable hours at the Living Library Time Bank. So I've been doing a lot of work in helping people understand the difference between basic time banking, which is more about psychology and sociology, about what value you bring to the table and how to recognize value in someone else, so that we can make advanced time banking possible, which redistributes global wealth and helps people to be able to have their needs provided for. So again, every time that you spend here, every hour that you spend, you can earn time dollars at the Living Library Time Bank. Just reach out to me if you would like to learn more. So Taniya, welcome. Welcome to our conversation today. So rather than ask people at the beginning of these conversations, who are you and what do you do? I like to ask the questions, how are you arriving and what are you bringing? So how are you arriving is just, how are you feeling today? What is most alive in your world? So just tell us what is alive for you today, Tanya. How are you arriving?
I'm arriving in a very, what's the word? In a very paced way. So I'm arriving as discovering and kind of being very excited about what I've discovered, which is paceology. So that's how I'm arriving, and I'm arriving in a very paced way because I feel like we live in a very, one of the most fast-paced eras that we've ever lived as human beings with technology and the technological innovation. And that affects our relationships with ourselves, it affects our relationships with God, it affects our relationships with each other, our relationships with nature, um, and so many other things, how we kind of feel we produce, how we kind of create. Yeah, so that's how I'm arriving today. I'm very paced, I'm very relaxed. And that was kind of intentional and conscious because I knew that I would be speaking to you about something I'm very passionate about and very committed to, which is what we affectionately call JCM, which is a interfaith encounter that's been happening. It's a conversation actually that's been happening for 50 years. So yeah, before even I started, I kind of encountered JCM.
Excellent. Thank you, Tanya. So in response, what I'm feeling is alive for me is being in right relationship. So when I'm hearing you speak about paceology and also about observing, how fast-paced our culture really is. I'm thinking about being in right relationship, how to be in right relationship with each other, with God, with the systems that we do have to, take part in
Mm-hmm.
as part of our lives. So that brings us to the second question, which is what are you bringing? And you started to allude to that already. What I'm bringing today is usually the intention, or what would you like to get out of this conversation? So I'm as someone who is a minister and someone who is, or I should say, a ministry candidate, someone who is interested in attending the JCM this year. I am bringing an intention, a desire to learn more about it and to learn more about your history with it, and yeah, just how this can contribute to the interfaith dialogues that I'm starting to have here in the United States as well. So back to what I'm bringing. What I'm bringing is a very clear intention to learn more about your personal history with the JCM. How did you get started with it? How long have you been involved with it? And yeah, just what are these conversations like? What are some of the challenges, and what are some of the what is some of the momentum? So yeah, go for it. I,
So my personal history with JCM is a very long history. And
Mhm.
it's not, what's the word? It's not a smooth history, let's just put it that way.
Okay.
And it's not what, yeah, I first came across JCM in 1992. I was very young. What would I have been? I don't know, in my early 20s. I was very young. I just qualified as a social worker a year ago. And I went to what was, it's no longer running, the women's JCM in Bendorf. That's where it used to be in Germany. Um, and it was, what would I say? It was an experience. The highlight of the experience for me was I'd always really been very fascinated. I'm Muslim, but I've always been very fascinated with Judaism and kind of just knowing more about the faith because it's very um, I went to a Christian C of E school for about a year and a half. So I was very used to like the Lord's Prayer, but Judaism I really didn't know that much about. So it was my first experience of like meeting rabbis, sort of experiencing the Friday evening Shabbat service and then the Torah reading in the Saturday morning. And but there was the reason why I feel it was such a, let's just put it, not a smooth experience, was with that particular women's conference. There was something like you couldn't talk about politics. There was this
Mm,
understanding that you couldn't talk about politics. And myself and my friends, majority who kind of arrived there in Germany were from London, most of us brown, most of us who had lived in like the UK for a long time. Either we'd been born there with a long kind of history of being part of the UK, whether we were from like Pakistan or Bangladesh or wherever. I'm very kind of, what's the word? Very strong and very confident in being British and Muslim. And
mm,
we were like this group of women that came, and the majority of the women that were there, whether they were Christian, Muslim, or Jewish, were like white, Western. Okay. And we we kind of were very uncomfortable with and kind of couldn't quite understand why politics was not being talked about. And we felt that it needed to be talked about because there was a lot of things that were being said about us and regarding us, and we felt like surrounded and kind of very misunderstood. And I remember she's now sort of very, very close friend. She's my spiritual teacher. She's my spiritual mother. Um, Basically, when we were kind of being surrounded and saying, we want to know about your pain, she very wisely said, you talk about pain that leads to anger. And we came to like this conclusion that for um for an interfaith encounter to be meaningful for all parties concerned, there cannot be a divorce of politics, a separation of politics and religion and spirituality. In fact,
mm,
religion and spirituality is also kind of also part of it. You can't just say, well, we're all religious here, we can't be spiritual. And you can't say we can't be political because, you know, for many of us, whatever our faith is, the personal is political.
mhm,
And it made me not want to go back to JCM until I went back 11 years later in 2003. And that was the mixed conference, both men and women. And there are also
mm,
LGBTQ um, individuals there. And that was a more positive experience. It was an experience I think feel like was positive because that divorce wasn't there, you know,
mm,
that it was
mhm,
very much having kind of natural conversations, but also difficult conversations. Difficult because of what's happening in the world, what's happening in the Middle East. Obviously, it's a it's an encounter for Abrahamic, faiths, and with what's happening in the Holy Land, affects all
Mhm.
of us in different ways and also in the same way. And then I went back in 2006, actually, with my eldest two sons. I think my eldest was about 9 at the time, and he had a really good experience. And my middle son would have been about 4. My youngest hadn't been born. And I remember he had such a close reading of the Bible, my eldest son, that the rabbis were really like really surprised. My God, that's such a close reading. Even we haven't read this. You're very and he went up to my spiritual teacher, my spiritual mother, saying, I want to become a rabbi. I want to become a Muslim rabbi.
Mm. Oh, wow.
And he still remembers it to this day, although he hasn't been back. And then I went in 2008 when my friend was the Muslim speaker for presenting the lecture. And then I've been back 2008, and then I went to 2016 where I actually presented a paper called God's Voice in a Secular Society.
Mm.
And then kind of went back quite often after that. 2017, I just went for the weekend for the just for the actual religious experiences, not for the other parts, because it's a whole week, for the Shabbat service and for the Torah reading and the Christian service. I missed the Jummah, the Friday prayers. And then I went back in when was it? 2017. Then I went back in 2020, just before the pandemic was announced. And then have been back 2023, 2024, 2025, and then this year, February 2026. And I'm now part of the planning team, which are like volunteers from each faith.
Mm. Very good. Very good. Yes, I will want to revisit how you became part of the planning team, but I want to focus in on, yes, this divorce of politics and spirituality. That's something that I think is very present for a lot of us who are on a spiritual path or consider ourselves on a spiritual path. That politics kind of becomes taboo in a lot of of what we're allowed to discuss. I'd like to ask you, so between 1992 and 2003, that 11 years where it eventually became mixed gender, and then there were more difficult conversations being introduced. From your perception, what do you think happened in those 11 years that made the JCM shift in that direction?
I don't think it really did shift. I just went to the women's conference. Um,
Okay,
the mixed gender was always happening. It's been happening for 50 years. I just didn't go to
okay,
that one.
got
Um,
it.
and because I didn't go to that one, maybe if I'd gone to that one, I would not have had that experience. And obviously sometimes the the way like people come together is to do with the way things are like planned by, and obviously something is evolving, and I don't know how the mixed gender one kind of evolved because I never went to the very first ones because it was
Mhm,
before my time. But
mhm,
I also feel like people like Professor Jonathan Maganey and like people like Zaki Badawi and those people that were involved in, like Rabbi Lionel Blue, who kind of were involved in the foundations and kind of like starting the conversation. I think that's the best way of putting what JCM is about. Were very wise and um visionary, in understanding the world and kind of what interfaith encounter uh, is will bring and kind of why it should like be meaningful and what kind of brings people back. And also maybe they kind of this is what they wanted from their conversations. And I think
Mhm.
sometimes when you bring your whole self into something, it then becomes meaningful for everybody else.
Mhm.
And I'm not saying that the women's wasn't meaningful, but I think somehow the people that organized it, they came to this until we came in 1992, this kind of understanding of that you can't, have politics and religion and spirituality like in the same room or the same conversation. And I feel some of some of the like challenges that we have, I'm one of the few. I mean, it's changed. JCM is now in Tanzania, and it's kind of an ongoing, like, encounter where, and it's also been in, like, in Indonesia. So, and we've also had a JCM in Israel, Palestine. So, it's obviously changed, but like in the early days, it was mostly white, Western, you know, individuals
Mhm.
kind of coming to this. And um, I'm not saying that politics isn't important to white Western people. Of course it is. But issues like racism, Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia, it's really important in an interfaith context that they are like talked about because ableism, the whole, they need to be like explored and talked about because they are a reality for some of the participants that come.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that. Some of the more challenging conversations that have happened, at the JCM and also in your world as a social worker. One of the reasons why I'm very very interested in this conversation with you is that I've had conversations over the summer with the founder of an organization called the Peace Center, and she is very passionate about cultivating a human library where we who were raised in either Christian faiths, in Judaism or even atheism, can sit and really just listen to what is the experience of someone who is Muslim, and what is that experience of Islamophobia. So I'd like to ask you, has that been discussed at the JCM, the issue of Islamophobia? And yeah, what do you recall from those conversations? What was the emotional experience for you? I'll let you yeah, it looks like you're ready to respond.
I'm going to be responding from memory because my whole uh sort of, I mean, it's called a lecture, but I mean, I wouldn't say it's a lecture because the lecture doesn't come from an academic perspective. Every single speaker that comes talks from a personal point of view, and God's voice in a secular society kind of looked at Islamophobia from a very, like, kind of going back in time and the kind of what happened in Europe with the Crusades. Now, Islamophobia is like is not just what's happening nowadays. It's something that's within our subconscious. And it's very much because it's phobia, this fear of Islam, this fear of Muslims coming and, taking over culture and society and kind of ruling the world, right? And kind of seeing them as the other, which was stirred up by the Crusaders who had their agenda of going and taking over the Christians, taking over the Holy Land, right? So they stirred all this hatred for Muslims. Um, and it was pretty kind of, there was a lot of bloodshed. and kind of recruited all their armies from different places in Europe to go to Jerusalem. And that is still within our subconscious. That still exists. It's very unconscious. And now, I mean, yes, with neo-fascism and techno-fascism and the narratives that are going on, it's it's kind of much more what's the word? Coming into consciousness, yes, over the last 30, 40, yeah, years. But it's always been there. And this is what most people don't understand, this fear of the other and not really understanding we are not the other. Where, our faiths, Islam is very similar to Judaism and Christianity. Most of the biblical prophets are also in the Quran. Most of the values, most of the and there was in like Muslim Spain, right? This, like this, cross-cultural fertilization of ideas. The Renaissance came about because of the Muslims in Spain. So lots of people don't really understand the actual this othering. They don't actually understand that this is going on. And then that, there's the aspect of racism, kind of most people kind of seeing, like Muslims as like brown and black, where, there are lots of white, yeah, white, Western and Eastern like Muslims. It's a faith. It's not about ethnicity, right? And I feel Islamophobia is something that is not understood from that conscious level, unconscious level, but also it's never really understood when it comes to kind of what's going on in the world and colonization with that context and how kind of certain ideas that were to do with Muslims kind of working with Jews and Christians and you know blooming culture, right? It is then like no, that they didn't do it because like they again that othering is kind of leads to this dehumanization now what we're seeing on a global level. um and when that kind of happens where you kind of see the other as not human, that can lead to kind of, and it is happening. It kind of, happened with the concentration camps in Bosnia, right? Kind of what's happening with the genocide, not just, I'm not just talking about Israel, Palestine. I'm not just talking about Gaza, kind of what's happening in Sudan, what's happening in a lot. And that's sometimes not just to do with faith. It's about the other, whether they're Muslim or black or brown or, you know, indigenous, there is this like fear, and where does that come from? Um, and I'm not saying Muslims have never been like racist, right? I'm not saying that, we are kind of, this wonderful people and have never done anything like inhumane. I'm not saying that, of course not. But this othering, I feel, has been done by most empires, including, Muslim empires. And it's just playing on people's unconscious fears. Does that make any sense, what I've just said?
Yes, absolutely it does. What's alive for me in that as well too is generational trauma.
Hmm.
Because it's like it's in that, like you said, it's in that subconscious. I would almost say it's even on that cellular level that there's this there's these stories of trauma that are kind of locked in that continue to to have that that emergence of othering, where we're othering the other person based on the differences. One of my we had a conversation last week, and we started to scratch the surface of this. And one of the ministers from Circle of Miracles, Reverend Grace Gallagher, made the observation that in our in our culture in the United States, especially in especially in more suburban cultures, it's almost like Islamophobia has been accepted, but anti-Semitism is completely taboo, completely, it's yeah, very you're not allowed to talk. You're not allowed to say anything bad, or anything negative or critical. And I think that comes across. What it does is it goes back to that observation you were making about this divorce of politics and spirituality, where if you're aligned with someone politically, you're safe. But when you start to walk the middle ground and begin to unpack some of those stories around trauma, that's when it becomes very dangerous for people's nervous systems. It becomes a taboo topic. So that's what's alive for me in that, and around looking at the stories that have been politicized over the years. The stories, that one side is telling about the other, from history like the Crusades to even recently, like 70 years ago, World War II, and what happened, what was happening there as well with the Jewish Holocaust and all of that. So yeah, so that's what's coming up for me is these colonialist white supremacist values that have emerged and been allowed to kind of been allowed to be exercised. Some of those have been that there's one right way of doing things. There's perfectionism. There's yeah, there's this there's this really this paternalism or patriarchy that has risen from that. And what we've learned with trauma informed or trauma responsive values is that there's a lot of there's almost like a reversal of this, where first of all, the peer-to-peer relationship is very important. Establishing mutuality between people. That's why these human library or living library conversations are so important, in that we're we're making an active attempt to unjudge someone, to break stigmas, and to kind of, for me, this is where I find I sometimes get alienated, is I'm looking for people who are willing to at least lean into the trauma a little bit, so that the nervous system can develop. So yeah, that's my piece on that. So I am going to turn it back to you.
And this is something we are exploring at JCM. I mean, the trauma comes up, right? At JCM, in the project groups, in the conversations that we have, in and I feel that the reason why JCM is beautiful and people kind of come back, they get what is called the JCM bug, I call it, right? Is in that week, right? With all the trauma that people are experiencing in their everyday lives, with the othering that is happening. And sometimes, the othering that is happening isn't just happening to Muslims. Sometimes I feel some Christians are feeling the othering. Definitely Jews are feeling the othering with the rise of anti-Semitism, right? And sometimes you feel the othering within your own faith communities, right? Because your views, your radical views, or your progressive views, or your liberal views are not understood within your own faith communities. And that's why sometimes when we like come and we kind of have it's because it's not JCM isn't just an intellectual kind of, it's not a conference, it's an encounter. That's the best way of it used to be described as a conference, but it's definitely an encounter because you encounter yourself, you encounter God and you encounter each other, not as the other, but a fellow human being. And sometimes the friendships that become like friendships for life are with, what normally would be the other, but isn't because you're kind of feeling the same, your struggles within your own community, your own faith community, that rabbi or that pastor or that social worker or, that person that's leading the NGO is having, right? And so um that trauma of what you're going through in everyday life, you then understand your fellow participant at JCM is also going through. And the trauma of, for instance, I just kind of recently watched a Bollywood film, क्या नाम था मैं I'm sorry, I'm going to say in Hindi, Urdu, मैं वापस आऊंगा. I'm going to return with Nasreddin Shah. It's on Netflix. And that trauma, for instance, for me as somebody that was born in Pakistan and my family originate from like India and then, Iran and then Saudi Arabia, right? Um, that trauma of partition is still within us, is still within us, within our genes, right? This kind of being forced out of your own kind of country and then, having to kind of live somewhere else, or half of your family, like in my case, my mum's side was in still in India and my dad's side was in, in Pakistan. This uprootedness is something that like is kind of goes down to the generations. And a lot of us are living in diaspora, um, and we kind of feel that fragmentation. But what I love about JCM is that it's, you just don't have those intellectual conversations. A lot of it is very experiential. You experience the Christian service, you experience the Jewish services, you experience the meditations, you you kind of experience each other by kind of like living with each other, like, having coffee and tea and like, breakfast, lunch and dinner. And so it's like the conversations that kind of happen informally are like kind of what makes you come back. It's not just all the formal stuff. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, but it sounds like it's more of the relationships, the emergent relationships that that keeps people coming back rather than the agenda. I'm going to see what my son wants here in a moment, but what comes up for me as well as far as experiencing the different services or experiencing the different cultures, that kind of comes back to what we were discussing a couple of weeks ago, how the experience of the interfaith leads to the relationship of the interspiritual,
Mhm.
where it's more about direct experience with the divine God source, whatever you want placeholder name you want to put on it. But yeah, I would like to ask now about how has, for you personally, Tanya, how has your, your journey in Islam led you to direct experiences with what we would call God, Spirit, Allah, the divine? I'd love to hear what your take on that is, and I'm just going to be listening, but also be taking care of things at home here.
My kind of relationship with God has always been, apart from a few years when I was agnostic between the ages of I think 18 and 21, my experience of God has all, and even when I was agnostic, I still was experiencing God, um, has been come from a very young, very young age because my mother was very, very spiritual and very like, my dad was agnostic for most of his life, but my mum was very committed to her faith, because my grandfathers were both like Muslim scholars, and my great grandfather apparently was this very famous Sufi from Bihar called Dr. Abdus Subhan, who is kind of very well known, not just in India, but kind of all over the world. And so she used to tell me the stories of the prophets, um, in the Quran, and they kind of used, she used to tell me late at night, so they used to kind of come alive. And so kind of I had very mystical experiences, probably from a very young age. So it was always very spiritual. And the stories of Joseph and David, in our state primary school, which was secular, we used to kind of have plays and kind of talk about it. So I always like had a connection to God and the stories, I'd say, of the Bible and the Quran. And I kind of always had this fascination, not just with, being Muslim and my own faith. I had a fascination with, Christianity and Judaism. And some of that I'd never really, some of it it was felt close to me, didn't feel the other or different, maybe because I also went to a C of E school where we said our Lord's Prayer, and um, like it kind of just became very kind of normal to me. And then when I kind of met my Jewish friends at JCM, and they kind of then invited me to their synagogues, and um, you know, Rabbi Sybil Sheridan plus my spiritual teacher, Sheikh Halima Krausen, started what was called Jewish Muslim dialogue in 2003. Um, it was like having conversations, but like they seemed like the conversations that we were having seemed to be, what's the word? Natural conversations, but also like what they're kind of going through. It didn't feel like, oh my God, this is like, it felt like, just natural and normal. That I think I'm not so sure if I'm kind of making any sense. So what they kind of experience is kind of what I'm experiencing. And kind of then for me, like going to a synagogue kind of just felt like home. It's like going to the mosque. Does that make any sense? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, what's alive for me when you are saying that, it's almost like the experience or the feeling, the emotional content was shared.
Mhm.
Even if the stories, so like the stories of the mosque or the stories of the synagogue, even though it's a different location, a different setting, what I'm hearing is the experience, the emotional content is shared, even if the story is told slightly differently.
Yeah, and also I think because I'm kind of versed in Arabic, I'm not fluent in Arabic, but I can read Arabic. I can read, um, it's very basic. I can read like Quranic Arabic, and Arabic and Hebrew are very similar. They're not exactly the same, but very similar. So some of the words in the Torah are very similar to the words in the Quran, although like the letters kind of change. Like there's salam and then there's shalom. And like, oh my God, like, when I heard and I can actually read in Hebrew, Ahad, which is Ahad, which means one, I was like, oh my God, like, and I kind of, and it's a different language, but it's not. It's kind of the same. And then I suppose the othering stops happening because you connect on that, I don't know if you call it an interspiritual level, you just connect on that human level. And what I love about JCM, which kind of doesn't really probably normally happen. Maybe it happened a long time ago, but nowadays in, this 2026 and the 21st century, even we might live in very multicultural, multi-faith communities. You don't have like this building where there's the same building as a shared building, and you have the choice of, going for like Jewish morning prayers just after you prayed like Muslim Friday prayers out, or like Christian prayers. Like, you've got like this variety and this choice, and you just, it's just like, a couple of floors down or on the same, floor. And you know, and that singing and that laughter and the even just like the silences are are so kind of beautiful compared to kind of the ugliness of this world. And I feel like I feel the reason why that beauty and that flowering of those relationships happen is because I'm very new to the JCM planning team, but I feel like the people in the planning team, like Leah Molstein, Rabbi Leah Molstein, Stefan Hartman, um, Kasha, who it is a nun, and people like Monica and all these people that have been on the JCM planning meeting far more longer than I have, Sheikha Halima, Karima, is because we've got like this structure for like of the fact that there's going to be like the lectures, there's the buzz groups, there's the project groups, there's what's called um you know like like this sort of like discussions where we kind of like meet interfaith, where what is shared is kept confidential, but and you speak for yourself, you don't speak for your community. And I feel like obviously this is something that's evolved and evolving, but that groundwork that has been done by the planning team, sort of been done for years before I kind of came along, is something that like holds sometimes when this conversation becomes very difficult. And when I say difficult, becomes painful. And kind of to hold that space requires skills and expertise and wisdom that I haven't really seen in other interfaith kind of contexts. I'm not sure if that makes sense, what I'm saying.
No, it makes perfect sense. And one of the things that come up for me is why I'm passionate in also reaching out to, we have Universalist Unitarian, or I guess it would be called Unitarian Universalist churches here in the United States, where where there is education and conversations across faiths. And that's something that you're reminding me that I want to continue to nurture relationships there. Another thing that came up, and this is just a little bit of a side note, but recently the military started started eliminating what they consider to be official religions, for the United States military, and the UU churches were taken away from that list of accepted religion. So that's something that I'm having conversations with other ministers here who are focused on interfaith and interspiritual. So yeah, so it makes a lot of sense to because there is also that resistance. I'm noticing that myself. I work with a friend who is Jewish, and we do this play about suicidality and bullying.
Mm,
And we would like to maybe present this in different churches or spiritual centers.
mhm,
And I'm noticing that when it comes to the really difficult conversations like dealing with suicide
mhm,
and bullying even, there's a resistance to that because academically each religion has their take on suicidality, and it's been the source of a lot of fear, a lot of pain.
mhm,
And um, yeah, it's kind of like that's where we would like to see it go from, the documented interfaith beliefs about suicide to, what is the direct experience? Have you lost somebody? Have you communicated with someone who had, who has crossed the veil after completing suicide? That's been coming up a lot in my world recently. But yes, definitely in response to what you are describing here, I do sense a resistance to those kinds of conversations when it's not in neutral ground or in neutral territory. Um, but there is so much resistance to coming to a neutral territory to have those difficult conversations across faiths.
Yeah, I kind of I feel like kind of what's just really remarkable. I mean, we also have Moshe Levi, who was born in Jerusalem and is like one of the professors in Haifa University. So Moshe and we in 2016 he presented the Jewish version of God's Voice in the Secular Society, and I presented the Muslim version. Is we have a
Hmm.
theme every year, and he and I became really, really good friends. And he brings the Israelis, where he also brings the Palestinians. And with all we all know kind of what's going on, you know, it's it's remarkable kind of what happens because the conversations regarding what's happening, and it happened during with what was happening in Gaza. We had um you know, Lena is an actress, and we had like the young Palestinians that she brings, and then we had that year in 20, I'm talking about 2024, which was one of the most difficult JCMs I've ever been to, where it wasn't that many of us. I think it was less than 30, one of the smallest JCMs. But we were talking about what was happening in Gaza. We did not stop talking. We cried. We, we allowed the anger. Um, we allowed the rage. I mean, not that it should or shouldn't be allowed, because it's there, it's present, and you can't not talk about it. And I feel, um, sort of with and sometimes it's not just about talking about what's happening in the Holy Lands. We also need to talk about, and we have talked about, what's happening in, um, the rest of the world, in Africa, Latin America, Ukraine, Kashmir, like all over the world, Australia, New Zealand. And this year, in February 26th, I met this really beautiful, you know, Brazilian rabbi, Andrea, and just kind of understanding. You probably are much more familiar with it, with kind of what happens to Latinos in the USA, and kind of what that perception of Latinos, and like that conversation that I had, it kind of like I kind of understood what she was talking about, because I've experienced that myself, being a brown Pakistani woman, the perception that, white, UK British people have of us. And it's, I feel like, JCM is remarkable in that aspect compared to other interfaith dialogue groups, whatever you want to call them, that I've been, where it just feels, I'm just gonna say it, right? It just feels fake. It just feels like polite, and it feels like, you know, and I know lots of interfaith groups are struggling with funding. JCM is one of them. But we have a rich like a history of understanding how to, the best way to put it is facilitate these very difficult and very painful conversations.
Yeah, thank you. And that's really where, having readiness, being ready, to step into something that's going to be uncomfortable, stepping into something that is going to challenge your perceptions, challenge your stories. And I celebrate that. I'm very much appreciative, and I celebrate that is, that is what the art of facilitation is really about. Is if we can't have safe spaces yet, how do we create brave enough spaces for people to, be able to lean into that discomfort just a little bit, so that the difficult conversations can become healing conversations. And that's yeah.
Yeah. and that's why, each one of us that are on the planning committee, we say, at the beginning, especially if it's your first JCM, like if you are finding it difficult, come and talk to one of us because some of it isn't like it's not easy. There's like, there anger comes up, pain comes up, distress comes up, embarrassment comes up, shame comes up, and sometimes you kind of, like just to have that safe space, you might not want to kind of talk it to somebody else within, the whatever the project group or something. You might just want to talk to it with us on a private and confidential basis. And, and sometimes what happens is people don't, actually feel like going to somebody from their own faith. They go to the other faith because they feel that that person in that planning team would be able to, like understand them. And we also have at the beginning, we have what's called the intra-faith
Mhm,
meetings where we meet at, the Muslims meet just with Muslims and the Christians meet just with the
mhm,
Christians and the Jews meet with just the Jews. And we kind of come together with who is going to lead the services, who's going to, you know, be the one that leads with the Jewish meditation, who's going to be the one that comes forward to do the JCM meditation. Um, and we have to kind of come together within our own faiths to kind of do the religious, part of it towards the
mhm.
end. And so a lot of this is like, even if you haven't maybe been in a leadership position before, most of us are leaders that come to it. You kind of become the leader by the end of your experience because you step up because you're also having to take some personal responsibility of kind of, I wouldn't say being an ambassador of your faith, but like, making it a good experience for everybody. Yeah, that's probably the better way to describe it.
Yes. Yes. Well, we're almost at the hour. We're almost at the top of the hour. See how
Yeah.
fast these go, these
Yeah, I
conversations
can
go?
see you've got about like 10 minutes according to my clock
Yep.
here. Wow. Yeah, they do go
Yep.
very fast. I mean, I could
Yeah.
talk about JCM all day because I
Hmm.
have I have got some very some beautiful friendships have blossomed because of it. And
Hmm.
it's, it's, we also have what's called a day trip where you kind of like go out and like we go and see the local whatever whichever city it is. We go and see the mosque and the synagogue and the Jewish
Mm.
Jewish cemetery and the church, and then we kind of like have a like a meal. And like as I was saying, it's remarkable that we have JCM in Germany where where the Holocaust kind of happened, and we never like forget that it happened. Um a- and it's people kind of coming from, we've had people like from America, Australia, Asia, Africa. So we've kind of come had, it is very international. Like I said, Brazil, it is very international. And you kind of meet people, that you probably wouldn't meet otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. I there was one thing I wanted to ask you, Tanya, because being involved in this in this endeavor and also your social work.
Hmm.
My wife is an art therapist and also kind of transferred over to social work over the last year. And
Hmm.
there's a lot of resistance to even mentioning anything that has to do with spirituality. My wife once told me the story of how she was helping a client and she had a book of like I don't know like Buddhist sayings or Buddhist teachings that she offered to to one of her clients, and she got in a lot of she got in some trouble for doing even that for kind of like just trying to help somebody by referring a book.
Mhm.
What has your experience like in social work? What has been some of the challenges and maybe some of the benefits to being involved in this interfaith work, as you are serving people in the social work area?
I think maybe it's a bit different. In the UK, I don't know. We have that's like been my experience has been different where you can talk about faith and spirituality. We have um when I was working for Wandsworth, I mean, I recently retired, we have what's called graces, where you look at, race and sexuality and spirituality and religion. Um, and those kind of conversations are really important when it comes to people's understanding of identity and also discrimination and kind of giving the best service as as a social worker to your client. So this is kind of something that we kind of like talk about in when we're kind of, teaching, especially even in social work teaching. I do once a year go to Kingston University and deliver the youth justice model. So, and especially in the UK, especially within my field, which was youth justice, there are a lot of um non-Muslim young people also like becoming Muslim and taking, converting inside like prisons and secure estate and even in the community. So for it not to be looked at, especially from a UK context, kind of doesn't really make any sense. And I was fortunate enough to have a team where my manager was very practicing Christian. And then we also had some other practicing Christians um, who were not, they weren't anti me bringing my faith and my spirituality into the work context and, like sharing it with young people or, I actually commissioned some training to do working with Muslim young people and what does that actually mean. Um, so kind of my experience is different, but I do understand that it sometimes happens. I think I remember in my early days of being qualified, there was this thing that you can't really talk about, like faith, you can't talk about it. And I feel then that's when secularism, like it is done in France, is then imposed upon certain organizations and you kind of like play down religion and you kind of make it even like spiritual or you play down spirituality, but I think I never could because it's very much part of me. And even when I kind of was training as a therapist, I was very much into Jungian psychology and studying Jung, who's very spiritual. So it kind of is so much part of me. Even when people said, well, you can't talk about it with your clients, I did talk about it. I'm a bit of a rebel that way. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you. Thank you. And it's encouraging to start having some of these cross-cultural conversations as well too, because I think I'm excited about sharing just this conversation, not only with with some of my spiritual friends, but also I do work with a mental health cohort as well, and I think
Mhm.
this conversation would be very helpful and very beneficial even in those circles. So as we're winding down, the last question I ask before we stop the recording is, what did you appreciate most about our conversation today? So when you take a moment to reflect on the journey we took in just the last hour alone, what is alive for you? What did you appreciate about our time together today, Tanya?
I feel like I was listened to. And that for me is really valuable in the day that we're living with, social media kind of trying to pull us apart. We're human beings at the end of the day, no matter how much melanin we have. And listening, as this young Palestinian girl said to me in 2023, I still remember, listening requires all the senses. And I feel like today, all the senses were listening to me. That's what
Mm.
I'd like to say.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, what I appreciate the most is how easy it was to listen to you. So that is something that I'm learning that the more, the more we are conversing with people who are on this journey, with us, the easier it is to, well, the language I use is feeling your nervous system being regulated, being calmed. And I think there's more happening than just the conversation itself. There's an energetic exchange. There's an energetic shift in just being able to be present. And
Mhm.
I really appreciate that. And I'm really appreciating just the richness of this last hour. I'm really excited about sharing this. And yeah, I'm really excited about sharing this with people in the different churches that I've been attending recently. And I
It
mean, we could
it
probably go on for hours
I
just
just
you
I
know.
feel like that what you've just said kind of just makes me, I just want to maybe end with this is there's a
Mhm,
fragrance that stays with you from JCM. It's like the fragrance that
mhm,
stays after Shabbat. So it stays the whole year until your next JCM because that
mhm.
richness, that fragrance, that experience, you kind of want to go back and experience that fragrance again, that richness again.